This will be a series on the Christian saints. So over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be examining the lives and stories of 12 individuals. Any people good at math here? How many is that each week? Good, 2. We're going to be doing 2 each week. But we need to begin by asking the question, what is a saint? A saint is a person known for their holiness, virtue, and closeness to God. That's generally how they're defined. Someone who has lived a life of exceptional faith and morality, and as a result, and this is what's key, has been formally recognized by the church. Okay. I'm sure many of you are saints, but unless you've been formally, well, I formally recognize Chris as a saint. But that has to be, it has to be formally recognized. And the saints we're going to be coming all come from the Roman Catholic tradition, okay, which involves a process known as canonization. And we're going to look at that to begin with.
You have to be Catholic?
To be a saint, well, Protestants say all members of the church are saints. Okay, so there's no one. That's kind of hard to believe sometimes. But sorry, just observation. But anyway.
Many saints that aren't Christian, because you had Christian saints up there.
No, there are Muslim saints. Okay, there are Muslim saints. Yeah. So canonization is a papal declaration that the Catholic faithful may venerate a particular deceased member of the church. Can't be alive. You had to be dead. Yeah. You have. Yeah. There's no living saints. All the saints, and as we'll see, early on, it took a long time. You had to be fast for quite a while. The Mother Teresa was an exception to the rule, and I'll talk a little bit about that. So, popes began making such decrees in the 10th century. Up to that point, local bishops governed the veneration of holy men and women within their own dioceses. And there may have been, for any particular saint, no formal decree up until about the 10th century. Such was the case with the 2 saints we're going to look at tonight, St. Stephen and St. Sebastian. These were 2 of the earliest saints, so they weren't canonized by a pope. In general, Protestant Christianity contends that according to the Bible, all believers are saints, whether they are alive or in heaven. It rejects the notion that the term saint only refers to those people who are particularly holy and recognized by the Catholic Church. Although, there's always an although, in the Anglican tradition, especially High Anglican, the tradition I came from, individuals who have lived lives of exemplary faith are honored and often commemorated as saints, but there's no canonization. Okay. So Episcopal is American. High Anglican, as my mother would say, is you have reference to saints, but there's not a process of canonization. It's more tradition than anything else. So the earliest Catholic saints, pre-10th century, tended to be martyrs. They tended to be martyrs, although there were exceptions. All circumstances accompanying martyrdom were to be inquired into by a local bishop. So if there had been a martyr, the local bishop would begin an inquiry into the martyrdom. The faith of those who suffered and the motives that animated them were rigorously examined and continued even with popes. This isn't something that's easy to obtain. There's rigorous examination of the person's life. Evidence was sought from court records or evidence from people who had been present at trials or had seen their lives. St. Augustine of Hippo, this is 430, tells of the procedure followed in his day. The bishop in which the martyrdom took place, set up a process for conducting the inquiry with utmost severity. That's Augustine writes that. You just can't allow someone to be a saint that really hasn't been examined tooth and nail. The acts of the process were then sent to the bishop or archbishop, who then carefully examined all the evidence, and after consultation with other bishops, declared whether the deceased was worthy of the name martyr and public veneration. So it was really in the hands of the bishops. It was really in the hands of the bishops. And you got to remember, the Pope is actually the Bishop of Rome. He was there were many early churches that you see those in Paul's letters, right? There was church at Corinth, Alexandria, Ephesus, and they all had bishops. So the Pope is a bishop, but they would consult and then they would decide whether that person who was martyred could be given sainthood. In subsequent centuries, procedures became increasingly regularized, and the popes began restricting to themselves the right to declare someone a Catholic saint through this process we call canonization. So at about the 10th century, only the popes or the Bishop of Rome decides. Before that, it was local bishop in consultation with other bishops. Candidates for canonization would undergo the following process. Now we're up to the 10th century, so this is where the popes will decide. It starts at the level of the diocese in response to a petition of members of the faithful. So you folks could make a petition to the local bishop that I should be a saint. And it would be easily rejected. No, you would find, if there was someone, but that's interesting, it would come from a petition from the faithful. It didn't come from the bishop or the archbishop. In response to the petition, members of the faithful, a bishop would see where the candidate died, to give permission to open investigation into the virtues of that individual. So there's always this deep investigation. Your life is really looked at very closely. Usually commences no sooner than 5 years after the death of the person. At least 5 years, and some were 100 years. It would take a long time. Although the Pope has authority to waive the waiting period if he so chooses. And that was done with St. Teresa of Calcutta by Pope John Paul II, and for Pope John Paul II by Pope Benedict XVI. They both waived that 5-year. Then there's an exhaustive search of the candidate's writings, speeches, sermons. A detailed biography of their life is written, and eyewitness counts are collected. So you'll have an entire biography on your life, eyewitness accounts. When sufficient evidence has been collected, the local bishop then presents the investigation of the candidate, who is now entitled a servant of God, to the congregation. This is the group, it's called the Congregation for the Causes of the Saints, and that's in Rome. So there is a body, a congregation. Their evidence is given to, sort of like a PhD examination, where the case is assigned to an officer who collects further evidence of the life of the servant. So you get your first batch of evidence, then more evidence is collected. At some time, permission is then granted for the body of the servant of God to be exhumed, 5 years, and examined. A certification known as non cultus is made that no superstitious or heretical worship or improper cult of the servant of God of his or her tomb has emerged. They must be looking for certain things on the exhumed body, in any case, and relics are then taken and preserved. The congregation, let's say you're the congregation, then recommends to the Pope that he proclaim the heroic virtue of that servant of God. That is, the servant of God exercised to a heroic degree the theological virtues of faith, hope, charity, and the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, temperance. From this time, the one said to be heroic in virtue is entitled a venerable. A venerable. A venerable does not yet have a feast day or permission to erect churches in their honor, and the church does not yet issue a statement of their beatitude. Not yet. But prayer cards and other materials may be printed. You can ask for their intercession as a sign of God's will that the person should be canonized. Beatification is a statement of the church that it is, quote, worthy of belief that the venerable is in heaven and saved. For a martyr, the Pope has only to make a declaration of martyrdom, which is a certification that the venerable gave their life voluntarily as a witness to faith or in an act of heroic charity for others. For a non-martyr, proof is required of 2 miracles. 2 miracles. If we look at recent canonizations, most of these miracles are almost always miraculous cures of some sort, because they're the easiest to judge, given the church's evidentiary requirements for miracles. To be canonized as a saint, like I said, 2 miracles must have been performed. Very rarely a pope may waive the requirement for a second miracle if he or the College of Cardinals or the Congregation for the Causes of Saints all agree that the blessed lived a life of great merit proven by certain actions. So there are, any system has its... This procedure was used in Pope Francis's canonization of Pope John the 23rd. Do you all remember what Pope John the 23rd was associated with? Vatican II. Vatican II was the famous council that really liberalized much of the Catholic position and has had counter-reaction lately, by the way.
What were his miracles?
They were waived. Well, his miracle was Vatican II. Yeah, and then if you look at the history of the Catholic Church, that was a major shift that opened it up to...
No people raised from the dead or cured of cancer or any of that type of thing.
No, not for him. Yeah. You got to go way back to get those. So then the saint is then assigned a feast day. Every saint will have a feast day. And if you are interested in saints, you can spend every day of the year at a feast day. Because if you ever look at, you can get the book of saints and it's thick. It's thick. We're only going to look at 12. So let's turn to our first saint. I'm going to look at the 2 earliest saints actually. Saint Stephen is our first saint. He's first mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles as one of the 7 deacons who were appointed by the apostles to distribute food and aid to members of the early church. So the apostles had appointed Stephen as a deacon to help distribute food to members of the early church. According to Orthodox belief, he was the eldest and is therefore called an archdeacon. An archdeacon. There was another deacon by the name of Nicholas of Antioch, and it specifically stated that he had been converted to Judaism from paganism. So it's assumed that Stephen was also Jewish. We don't know, but remember, early Christianity hadn't made that break. All early Christians were Jews who believed that Jesus was the Messiah. So it was still within that Jewish tradition. It's not till later that you get that fundamental break. And even then, the early churches didn't really speak of Jesus as the Christ. They spoke of the followers of the way. Christians were followers of the way initially. In any case, that's getting a little... So, the reason for they appointed these deacons, there was some... If you read it, we might think that the early Christian communities were all wonderful and together. And no. As in any community, there was strife, and there was apparently dissatisfaction amongst the Hellenistic Jews. Those are the Jews who live outside of the Holy Land, in the Greek areas, that their widows were being slighted in preference for the Hebrews. So background was an issue. So that's why he was appointed. The name Stephanos is actually from Koine Greek. And so it's assumed that he was one of these Hellenistic Jews. Yeah? And that might not seem important to you at this point, but it was very important at that point. The Hebrew Jews always saw themselves as a step above, because the Hellenistic Jews were second class. So there was that conflict. So he gets involved in that. He's stated to have been full of faith in the Holy Spirit. He is, and these are traditions, to have performed miracles among the people. And it seems to have been among the synagogues of the Hellenistic Jews that he performed his teachings, signs, and wonders, since it is said he aroused the opposition of the synagogues of Anatolia. Anatolia is the area of today we call Turkey. Members of these synagogues challenged Stephen's teachings. But Stephen bested them in debate. And this is all tradition. Tradition claims that they made false testimony that Stephen had preached blasphemy against both Moses and God. He was made to appear before the Sanhedrin, which was the highest council or legal court of Jewish elders, who accused him of preaching against the Second Temple and the Torah. In a long speech, and we have the text, it's most of Acts 7, Stephen presents his view of the history of the Israelites. The God of glory, he says, appeared to Abraham in Mesopotamia, not in the Holy Land, thus establishing at the beginning of the speech one of its major themes: God does not dwell only in a particular building, which was believed to be the temple in Jerusalem. He recounts the stories of the patriarchs in some depth and then goes into detail about Moses. He says God appeared to Moses in a burning bush and inspired Moses to lead his people out of Egypt. Nevertheless, the Israelites turned to other gods. This was his second theme: Israel's disobedience to God. So they were saying, these are blasphemous. These things are blasphemous. Stephen faced two accusations legally: that he declared Jesus would destroy the temple in Jerusalem, and that he had changed the customs of Moses. In other words, he had changed the Torah. You can't get any harsher accusations than those. Still, Stephen denounced his listeners as stiff-necked people, which didn't win him any admirers, who like their ancestors had resisted the Holy Spirit. This is the quote. Which of the prophets have not your fathers persecuted? And they have slain them, which showed before of the coming of the just one. Who's the just one? Jesus. Of whom ye have been now the betrayers and murderers, who have received the law of the disposition of the angels and have not kept it. That passage, unfortunately, has also been very misused. Can you see how? In terms of anti-Semitism. Okay. It's accusing the Jews of being the killers of Christ. And that would be a trope that was used throughout the Middle Ages. In any account, the account claims the crowd could no longer contain their anger. Stephen looked up and cried, "Behold, I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing on the right hand of God." The people laid down their coats and began to stone him. That was the form of execution in those days. You read about it in the Bible all the time, stoning. Now, someone of great importance was there. And this is the stoning. Did I have him? Wait a second. Okay, I don't have him. Does anyone know who was there? Saul at the time, who would later become Paul. He was at the stoning of St. Stephen. And some of the coats fell at his feet. So it's believed that by not doing anything, he had consented. And he later, if you read his epistles, he talks about how he had really been involved in some horrendous activities against early Christians. Stephen prayed that the Lord would receive his spirit, that his killers would be forgiven, sank to his knees, and died. In the aftermath of his death, the remaining disciples fled to distant lands. Why? Better. Yeah. The exact site of Stephen's stoning is not mentioned in Acts. There are, however, two different traditions. One places the event at Jerusalem's northern gate. If you've ever been to Jerusalem, you know there are 4 gates, north, south, east, and west. While another, dated to the Middle Ages, locates it at the Kidron Valley near the eastern gate and the Mount of Olives. That's Gethsemane. Okay? If you've ever been there, then you walk up to the eastern gate, which leads to the Via della Rosa. So the two traditions developed. It was one of those two sites just outside the gates of Jerusalem. One of the reasons being you didn't stone anyone inside Jerusalem. The stoning would always take place outside. Acts 8:2 says, "Devout men then carried Stephen to his burial and made lamentation over him. But the location where he was buried is not specified." So we really don't know historically. We only know by tradition. In 415, a priest named Lucian purportedly had a dream that revealed the location of his remains at a place called Beth Shemesh, which is about 19 miles west of Jerusalem. His relics were taken in procession to the church of Hagia Zion on December 26th, 415, making it the date for the feast of St. Stephen. The church was located just outside the walls of the old city near the Zion Gate. It was destroyed, however, in 614, and in 430. Earlier, relics were then taken, or after that, relics were taken to a new church, and that's now the 20th century French Catholic Church. Saint Etienne was built in its place. while a Greek Orthodox church of St. Stephen was built outside the Eastern Gate. If you've ever been to the Mount of Olives, you know there are a number of churches, and one of those is the Orthodox Church to St. Stephen. So he's our earliest martyr. And there are numerous churches to him throughout the Catholic world. Believe it or not, this is the Greek Orthodox Church that I just talked about on Mount Zion. Oh, you know where Kerala is? India. There's a St. Stephen's Cathedral in Kerala, India. But the most famous is St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna. Romanesque Gothic cathedral, founded in 1137, dedicated in 1147, in the presence of Bishop Otto of Freising and German nobles. The first structure was completed in 1160. There's been major reconstruction that lasted until 1511. 400 years of remodeling. And repair and restoration projects continue to the present day. If you've ever been to any of the major cathedrals in Europe, you know they're all, generally half the time you're being there, they're doing something. They're remodeling or rebuilding. It stands 446 feet tall and is affectionately referred to by inhabitants as Steffel, which is a diminutive form of Stephen. Its massive south tower is the dominant feature. It's known for its tiled roofs. Richly colored, 364-foot long roof, covered by how many glazed tiles would you guess? 230,000. 230,000 glazed tiles. Above the choir on the north side of the building, tiles form a mosaic of the double-headed eagle, symbolic of the empire ruled from Vienna during the Habsburg dynasty. If you know anything about the Habsburg dynasty. On the north side, the coat of arms of the Republic are depicted. And then there's this. It's famous for its bells. Very famous. It currently has a total of 22 bells. And these aren't bells that people are playing. These are bells. And this one, known as the Pumarin bell, or sometimes Mary's bell, is the largest bell. It weighs 44,380 pounds. The largest bell in Austria, and the third largest swinging bell in Europe. It has a diameter of 10 feet and a height of 9 feet. It bears relief showing the Blessed Virgin and a scene from the Ottoman siege of Vienna. Now, what's interesting, this bell is only rung several times a year, only on special occasions. The four that I know of are Easter, Pentecost, Christmas Eve, and St. Stephen's Day. We happen to have the good fortune to have been in Vienna on Easter, and we heard it ring. Here's the interior. Contains 18 altars and numerous chapels. The high altar represents the stoning of St. Stephen. It is framed by figures of patron saints from the surrounding areas and surmounted with a statue of Mary, which draws the viewer's eye to a glimpse of heaven where Christ awaits Stephen. It's It's a magnificent altar. It's a magnificent altar. The stone pulpit, isn't that amazing? Is a masterwork of Gothic sculpture. The sides of the pulpit are stylized petals from a supporting stem. On the petals are portraits of the 4 original doctors of the church. I don't know. Unfortunately, can you see? I wish we had a bigger screen. You probably can't see them. But St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, St. Gregory, and St. Jerome. They all have their faces on that pulpit. As mentioned earlier, his feast day is December 26th. It's a public holiday in many Catholic dominant countries. So there's Christmas followed immediately by St. Stephen's feast day. This is interesting. On the Isle of Man, a wren was hunted on every St. Stephen's day. The wren's body would be hung inside a frame of holy wreaths. These wren bushes were then held aloft on poles and paraded in neighborhoods by what were called wren boys. What I like about this is this shows you how local traditions often impact the major tradition. In the study of religion, you have your dominant major traditions, and then you have your subcultural traditions that stem off from those. So these were the wren boys. At the end of the day, a funeral was held for the wren. Stephen is a patron saint of deacons, stonemasons, and those who suffer religious persecution. Yeah. So
how does a wren relate to
I have no idea. You'd probably trace it in some local tradition. That's what people do PhDs on. These little aspects of some culture. Anyway, I shouldn't make fun of that. Okay. There he is. Patron saint, I like that. Stonemasons and those who suffer religious persecution. So now let's move to our second saint, Saint Sebastian. You've probably heard more about Saint Sebastian. According to the traditional account, he was a man from southern France, educated in Milan, Italy, and then in 283, he entered the Roman army. Because of his courage under Emperor Domitian, who was unaware that he was a Christian at the time, he became a captain of the Praetorian Guard. The Praetorian Guard were the personal bodyguards of the emperor. They were the ones who were given ultimate trust. It's interesting that a number of emperors were slain by their Praetorian Guards. If you want someone to get to the emperor, if you get a Praetorian Guard, because they were, in any case. So he was made a Praetorian Guard. He's a Christian. Domitian is not aware of it. So according to tradition, these are traditional stories, there were 2 twin brothers by the name of Marcus and Marcellinus. And they were from a very distinguished family, Roman family. They became Christians and became deacons. Both were married and resided in Rome with their wives and children. And they refused to sacrifice to the Roman gods and were arrested. If you didn't sacrifice to the Roman gods, that was considered unpatriotic. You had to sacrifice to the Roman gods. And Christians would not do that. That was one of the reasons that many were arrested and sent to into the arenas to fight, etc. So anyway, these 2 from an upstanding Roman family. These weren't from the lower plebeian class. These were from the patricians. And they had become Christian. They were visited in prison by their parents, by the name of Tranquilius and Martia. What did they try to do? What would you try and do? Well, you're not going to be able to free them, but you might be able to get them to do what? Renounce their conversion. Yeah. I mean, let's give these people a little bit of leeway. Your son and your daughter have just been arrested and put in jail and are just about to be executed, and you go down there. You know, it would take pretty strong, and you're not of the same religion that they are. So they try to get them to renounce. But this is where Sebastian becomes important. He succeeded in converting them, as the tradition goes. Also, as well as a person by the name of Tiburtius, who was the local prefect. So, again, these are traditions, but he had a pretty charismatic way about him. Maybe that's the way to put it. And he was able to convert these people. Another official by the name of Nicostratus and his wife were also converted. Now, you're the Roman emperor, and you see that a lot of your officials are being converted by this strange cult, as they saw it. Okay? What is going to be your reaction? Yeah, not a good one. So he made all these conversions, and Domitian decides this has to end. This has to end. So, he concealed his faith, but in 286 it was detected. Okay? Domitian found out. Reproached him for his betrayal, and commanded him to be led to a field and bound to a stake, and that the chosen archers from Mauritania would shoot arrows at him. That's a famous painting. You may have seen that. There are perhaps he perhaps leads saints in paintings. You can see why. The subject it might be gruesome, but it's also riveting, right? But this is interesting, and this a lot of people don't know. So you're going to learn something tonight. This didn't kill him. Tradition usually said this is how he died. It didn't kill him. A medieval source book says, and the archers shot at him till he was as full of arrows as an urchin is full of pricks, and thus left him there for dead. Miraculously, the arrows did not kill him. A widow by the name of Irene of Rome went to retrieve his body, because she thought he had been killed, to bury it, and discovered, lo and behold, he wasn't dead. She then brought him back to her house, and for some time nursed him back to health. So he's healthy again. One day after he had finally healed, Sebastian stood by a staircase in the royal residence where the emperor was going to pass. As he passed, Sebastian scolded him for his cruelties to Christians. Now Domitian thinks he's dead. The outburst from a person who is supposed to have been dead astonished the emperor. Recovering from his surprise, he gave orders for Sebastian to be seized and beaten to death. That's how he actually died. And his body was thrown into a common sewer. A holy lady named Lucina privately removed the body and buried it in the catacombs at the entrance of the cemetery of Calixtus. If you've ever been to Rome and visited the catacombs, you know they are underground, and there are many of them. And one of the most famous is this at Calixtus. Remains reputed to be those of Sebastian are housed in Rome at the Basilica of Saint Sebastian. It was built by Pope Damasus I in 367 on the site of the provisional tomb of Saints Peter and Paul. Other authors relate that in the reign of Louis the Pious, Pope Eugenius II gave the body of Sebastian to the abbot of Saint Denis in France. So, here, have the body. And it was deposited at Saint Médard Abbey at Soissons, December 826. The story isn't over. In 934, his cranium was brought to Eblersberg, Germany. A Benedictine abbey was founded there and became one of the most important pilgrimage sites in southern Germany. It is said the silver encased cranium was used as a cup for what? For the Eucharist. Yes. The consecrated wine of the Blessed Sacrament to the faithful during the feast day of Saint Sebastian. If you've ever been to any of the major cathedrals, you know I think all of them have some relic. That's what they're known for. We saw the left arm of John the Baptist, I think. Where was that? That was in Siena, I think. Siena. Anyway, they're all known, and usually they only come out. They don't come out. They're not just sitting there. Usually, once every cycle of years, they appear. Now, people mock relics, but this was why these places became pilgrimage sites. They were believed to be holy and to have spiritual power. Now, these are things, of course, that Protestants went, bleh. You only worship God and you only worship Him directly. You don't worship Him through statues of Mary, or you don't worship Him through all these relics. But as a popular religion goes, the relics are powerful things. They're very powerful in most religions I've studied. Whether they're true or not really doesn't matter. What matters is if you believe it's true. You ever thought about that? When you're studying a group of people, you're not there to study whether what they believe is true or not. That they believe it's true is much more important, because this will explain a lot of the things that they do. So I kind of like relics, actually. It is, yeah, okay, so we're almost finished here. So the belief that Saint Sebastian was a defense against the plague. During the Middle Ages, it was believed that he became a defense against the plague, which added to his reputation and which largely accounts for enormous increase in his importance. Because if you know anything about the bubonic plague that swept Europe and took 1/3 of the entire population, you think COVID was bad? 1/3 of the entire population. Now, you're probably asking yourself, what's the connection of a martyr shot with arrows with the plague? There is an answer. And this was given by, it was called a stagnation. If you've ever looked at the pustules of the plague. And it said that the arrow wounds looked very similar, because those arrows sort of pop out. I mean, not the arrow, but they pop out the skin. So somehow an association was made between those arrow wounds and the pustules of the bubonic plague. This is what a Catholic theologian said in the 16th century. Visually, the arrow wounds call to God for mercy to us, as the symptoms of the infirm call for pity from the passerby. Okay. When you had the plague, no one wanted to get near you you were calling for mercy. Only a saint could intervene at that level. One of the chroniclers relates that in 680, Rome was actually freed from the pestilence by Sebastian's intercession. Is that true? Was it believed by many that it was true? Did it have a power with that? Okay. Yeah, the power of belief. When I talk about belief, I don't talk about true or false. It's what people feel deeply to be true. And if someone feels something really deeply to be true, it's pretty hard to argue them out of it. And you can see that sometimes from a rational point of view, how could you believe that? But when it gets a hold on whatever you call it, it's hard. So the power of belief, it's very powerful. The medieval text, the Golden Legend, transmits the episode of the Great Plague that afflicted the Lombards, which was stopped by the erection of an altar in the honor of Saint Sebastian. The earliest known representation of Sebastian, this is the basilica, is this. It's called the Martyr's Panel. It dates around about 527 to 565. Do you see all the martyrs lined up at the bottom? They all look the same. If you were to go up and just look at the work of art. How do we know which one is Saint Sebastian? They're named. No, they're named. But it's called the martyr, and this is the first representation that we have, and it appeared in the 6th century. How many martyrs are there? 26. 26. And they're represented in what is known as the Byzantine style, which lacked individuality. They all have identical expressions. For a reason. Saints aren't individuals anymore. They're of another order. Okay? And it's kind of, what's interesting, this mirrors ancient Egyptian art. The pharaohs all look, if you've gone to a museum and you've seen it, they all have the same face, the same expression, except for one. He was known as Akhenaten. And he was the rebel pharaoh who wanted to make his bust original, and he didn't end up well. Going against tradition is not an easy thing, in any case. So, there's another representation found in this church. It's called St. Peter in Chains in Rome. If you've ever been to the church where you see St. Peter, St. Sebastian is also in that church. It shows a bearded man in a court dressed, but no trace of an arrow, which is interesting. The archers and arrows and paintings didn't begin until 1000. And ever since have been more commonly shown than the actual death by clubbing. So it was the artists who kept painting his death as being, that led to people's knowledge or belief that he was killed by arrows, where he was actually clubbed to death. He occupied a very important place in the medieval mind. He was among the most frequently depicted of all the saints. Of all the saints. By late Gothic and even Renaissance artists. His shooting with arrows was the subject of the largest engraving. It's by an unknown artist, and it's called Master of the Playing Cards. Among the famous artists who depicted him, Botticelli, Titian, Guido Reni. So he has been the subject of many of the great artists. By the way, Guido Reni painted him 7 times. We have 7 different paintings of this. His church day, if you're interested, January 20th. In fact, it'll be on a Tuesday night. Well, we'll have to think about that. Reverend Albert's doing next week, and then I'll be here on the 20th. We'll see. He's formerly known as he's the patron saint of archers, pin makers, athletes, and a holy death. So that's our first class. Like I said, these 2 saints were not canonized by a pope. They were the first 2, and they came from local bishops who later canonized them. It's not till the 10th century that we start getting popes canonizing. I'm not sure who Albert's doing tomorrow, so I'm going to leave that as tomorrow, next week. So that's we discussed it, but I've forgotten. So my next 2, I think, will be Francis and Clare. Francis and Clare of Assisi. Yeah, Clare came from Assisi as well. Yeah. Okay. Any thoughts, questions? Okay. See you next time.